Around 2 a.m., aside from a few dim lights in the corridors, it was mostly dark. I could barely make out the shapes and shadows in my 10 by 10 cell. Lying on my back with my hands behind my head, my mind was racing instead of sleeping like it should have been. Thoughts drifted to things I wished I could forget. I heard footsteps. I started counting. 7, 8, 9, 10. Then, I saw him. His face was hard and expressionless, just like everyone else around here. He was doing his rounds, not looking to make friends. I wasn't sure if he saw me, but it didn't really matter. He was out there, and I was stuck in here. Once he passed by, I stopped counting. No point. He wouldn't be back for another 90 minutes. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about what to do when I got out. 5 days and a wake-up, and I'd be out for good. 7 months of my sentence nearly served. My job was waiting for me, but everything else had changed. My older brother, Gary, had taken care of my car, kept my house in order, and managed my fading savings. Was I still angry? Angry wasn't even close to how I felt, but I'd buried that anger for now. I needed to hold it all in until I was out of here. I understood why men who did 10, 15 years came out broken, hollow shells of themselves. You leave all traces of your humanity at the door when you come into this place. Survival becomes the only thing that matters. And this place? It was a cakewalk compared to the maximum security prison upstate. I closed my eyes, hoping for a couple of hours of sleep. I missed my old bedroom with its blackout curtains. But deep down, I knew my life wouldn't be the same. "I'll pick you up next Tuesday," Gary had told me during our last visit, looking at me through the thick plexiglass wall. Hopefully, it was the last time I'd see him like that. "Anything you want to eat your first night out?" he'd asked me. "A steak. A big one. Medium rare?" Gary had laughed. "Man, you're too easy. I thought you'd ask for something harder to sneak by my wife." "You'll stay with Andy and me until you're back on your feet," Gary had said. "There's not much left at your place, no food or furniture, but this way you've got time to get settled. It's not the Ritz, but you can come and go as you please." I had thanked him, but before I could say more, he cut me off. "Forget it. We're family, Steve. That's what family does." He tried to reassure me about Mom and Dad, too, but I knew better. "They'll come around once things cool down," he'd said. But I wasn't holding my breath. Things had gotten deep between us, and it wasn't going to change soon. "Seen my kids lately?" I'd asked. "Yeah, 2 weekends ago at Mom and Dad's. Heather looks the same. But John, he's got that awful bowl cut all the boys are sporting now." Told him it looked bad, but he said, "You're not my dad, so you don't get to tell me." I wanted to smack him, but Mom was there. Gary chuckled. "You'll have your hands full with that one." I sighed. John would never have said something like that when I was around. I was still their dad, no matter what. Heather and I were divorced, but I wasn't giving up my rights to them. I'd take my time once I got out. I wasn't in any rush. The house was still half mine. After all, Heather owed me around $65,000 to buy me out. She'd probably raided the safe deposit box for our bonds and CDs, but I'd made sure my lawyer had a full inventory of everything. She wasn't going to get away with anything this time. Heather and my so-called friend Bob had blindsided me once, but I was ready now. I'd been caught off guard before, but not again. I was waiting, thinking, and looking forward to getting out of this place. That's when I could start over. Back then, life was good. At least I thought it was. 12 years of marriage, 2 kids, a nice home. It all seemed solid. Sure, Heather and I had our small disagreements, but nothing that made me think it was all going to come crashing down. I had no idea what she was capable of. We didn't have a huge circle of friends, mostly just a few couples from the neighborhood. People like Bob and his wife, Connie, who had been trying for years to have a kid but never could. Heather had known Connie for years, but I stayed out of it. A year ago, Connie had started drinking hard. At first, it was sad, but things got ugly fast. Bob didn't drink much, so he always ended up babysitting her. "Bob, honey, bring me another drink," she'd say. By the end of the night, Bob was hauling her out, barely conscious. It was embarrassing. "Connie was a mess tonight," I'd said to Heather after one of those nights. She passed out twice. Greg and Judy probably left early because she started stripping down and asking Greg to help her into the pool. It was sad, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She's taking it out on Bob, Heather had said. I told her to look into adoption, but she won't. Blames Bob for everything. Well, they'll figure it out or get divorced, I replied, getting into bed. We're supposed to have dinner with them next week. I just hope she keeps it together for one night, Heather had said, trying to stay hopeful. But she didn't keep it together. At dinner, Connie yelled at the waiter, slurred her words, and berated Bob again. I had to step in. Come on, Connie, let's dance, I said, pulling her out of the situation. She resisted, but eventually gave in. Heather stayed at the table, talking to Bob, who looked miserable. After 3 songs, Connie excused herself to the bathroom. When she didn't come back after 5 minutes, I sent a couple of women in to check on her. One of them peeked out and said, "She's passed out cold in the stall." Sighing, I went in, propped her up by the sink, and splashed water on her face. She stirred for a moment but quickly slumped back down. She was out cold again. I practically had to carry Connie back to our table. "Bob, let me help you get her to your car," I said, holding up a barely conscious Connie. "She's out cold and not waking up anytime soon." Bob looked embarrassed and tired. "Steve, I've got it. Just sit down. This isn't the first time, but it'll be the last." Even though he tried to brush me off, I wasn't going to let him do it alone. I helped carry her out while Bob grabbed her purse and muttered quick goodbyes to the few people left. I laid Connie in the back seat of their car and patted Bob on the back. "Sorry, man. I don't know what else to say." Bob sighed heavily, looking defeated. "Thanks for the help. I'm at my wit's end here. I really don't know what to do anymore." "You two need help, Bob. Counseling, something. You can't keep doing this on your own. If you ever need support, you know Heather and I are here," I told him. "We'll help however we can." "Yeah, thanks," Bob replied, though I could tell he didn't mean it. Their problems were deep. Too deep to fix, it seemed. I gave them a few months, tops. Sadly, I wasn't far off from the truth, but none of us expected what happened next. 3 weeks later, it was just past 10:30 p.m. on a Thursday when we heard sirens and saw bright lights at the end of the street. Curious, like everyone else, I told Heather to stay put. "I'll check it out," I said, walking toward the commotion. People had gathered, and when I got there, I saw fire rescue working on prying open the driver's door of Bob's car. "What's going on?" I asked, suddenly anxious. "Is Bob okay?" Someone in the crowd turned to me, shaking their head. "It's not Bob. It's Connie." They were arguing, and she grabbed his keys, took off, and sped down the street. Didn't get far before crashing into a parked car. I watched, helpless, as the ambulance arrived, loading Connie onto a stretcher. Bob climbed in after her, looking devastated. Their front door had been left wide open, lights on, the house a mess. I called Heather and filled her in, then locked up Bob's house, leaving a note that I had his keys. When I got back home, Heather was waiting. "How's Connie?" she asked. "Not good." She wasn't wearing her seatbelt. She swerved and hit a parked car head-on at about 35 miles per hour. The airbag went off, but she hit the driver's side window so hard it shattered. "Bob's with her at the hospital. Should we go there?" Heather asked, concerned. I shook my head. "He's got his hands full. We'll go tomorrow once things settle down." We kissed goodnight, but sleep barely came that night. The image of Connie in that ambulance stayed with me. The next morning, around 11 a.m., my phone rang. It was Heather. "Steve, Connie's on life support," she said, her voice frantic. "I'm leaving work now. Bob's falling apart. Meet me at the hospital." I cursed under my breath. Bob really couldn't catch a break. I picked up some sandwiches on the way to the hospital, figuring no one had eaten. I also called Heather's parents to pick up our kids after school. When I walked into the waiting room, it was filled with a heavy, somber mood. Heather and a few others were sitting with Bob, trying to comfort him. I quietly approached and sat down beside them. "How's she doing?" I asked softly. "Not good," Heather whispered. "The doctor said there's little to no brain activity." Bob's struggling with what to do. Bob sat slumped in a chair, his eyes red from crying. "Steve, she's not going to recover," he said in a broken voice. "The doctors are talking about turning off the machines. They're pushing me to make a decision, but she's my wife. I can't just Pull the plug. He broke down again, tears streaming down his face. I motioned for the others to give us a little space. Have you called her parents? I asked. Yeah, they're on their way, he muttered. The hospital keeps asking about a living will and organ donation. It feels like they're circling her like vultures. I just want her to be okay. Why can't they fix her? They're doctors, damn it. I didn't have an answer for him. Connie's parents arrived shortly after and went straight into her room. There was a lot of loud crying and blaming. Her father seemed to be holding Bob responsible for everything. After about 20 minutes, they came out looking shattered, knowing they'd never speak to their daughter again. That night, we left the hospital around 8 p.m. I picked up the kids from Heather's parents' place and kept thinking about what Bob was going through. I hoped I'd never have to make that choice myself. 2 days later, with Bob, Connie's parents, and the doctor in the room, they turned off the machine keeping her alive. She passed quietly. Bob was a wreck, and we did our best to support him, but it was hard to know what to say. Despite all her issues, Bob really loved her. The funeral was huge, and everyone was in tears. Bob took it especially hard, understandably. He took a month off work to go back east and visit family, and I promised him I'd keep an eye on his place while he was gone. I love you. You know that, right? I told Heather one night, a few weeks later. Life had gone back to normal, but those weeks had worn us out. If I ever end up like Connie, just pull the plug, Heather said quietly as we got ready for bed. I don't want to be kept alive like that. Don't say that, I replied, shuddering at the thought. It won't happen to us. When Bob returned a few weeks later, he seemed more like himself, though the loss had clearly left its mark. Heather helped him go through Connie's things, and after a few months, he was starting to recover. The neighborhood made sure he stayed involved, even setting him up on a few dates, though none of them really went anywhere. Life went on, or at least it seemed that way. 6 months later, Bob seemed to have his spark back. Seeing him smile again was a relief, and for a while, things seemed to be returning to normal. But with Heather and me, something felt a little off. We were still close, still physically together, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. After a few months, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to ask, Heather, is something wrong? You've been distant lately, I said one night. She paused for a moment before replying, Nothing really, Steve. Why do you ask? She smiled. Maybe you haven't been getting enough lovemaking. If you want more, just ask. Lovemaking? I thought. She'd never called it that before. It was always just sex. I smiled, kissed her, and pushed the strange feeling out of my mind. I'll never forget Friday, August 20th. It was the day everything in my life shattered. Heather called me at work to say the kids would be staying with her parents for the weekend and asked what time I'd be home. I'll make sure I'm home early. Need me to pick up anything? No, just let me know when you'll be here. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was 3:30 p.m., just an hour and a half before I could leave. I tried to focus on work, but my mind was already racing. The thought of a weekend alone with Heather made me grin as I adjusted my pants, already anticipating what the night would bring. I drove home carefully, trying to avoid any speeding tickets, but still made it in just under 30 minutes. I should have suspected something when I saw 2 cars in the driveway. One of them was Bob's. Hey, honey, I'm home, I called out as I walked inside. Bob and Heather were sitting in the kitchen. Hey, Bob, what's going on? Bob looked uncomfortable. Steve, I need to talk to you. Please, have a seat. Heather's face looked pale, her voice shaky. Steve, I wanted to tell you this myself before you get the papers. I stared at her, confused. What papers? She took a step back, barely able to get the words out. Divorce papers. My heart stopped. Divorce? What are you talking about, Heather? Bob tried to interject. Steve. I cut him off, furious. Stay out of this, Bob. This is between me and my wife. I looked from Heather to Bob, then back to Heather. Something terrible clicked in my mind. Bob, you need to leave. Now. My fists were clenched, my heart pounding. Steve, you and I need to talk, Heather stammered. Bob, get out. Now. I shouted, my voice trembling with anger. Steve, this involves him too. Heather's voice was barely a whisper. I glared at her, then at Bob. Bob, if you don't leave right now, you'll be leaving in a body bag. He didn't wait for another warning. Bob grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Heather stepped forward. Steve, I'm in love with Bob. I'm sorry. I stood frozen. What? How long has this been going on? Even before Connie died, she admitted. That was all I needed to hear. You've got to be kidding me. I turned to Bob, who was standing near the door, and pointed at him. While I was comforting you over your wife's death, you were screwing mine. Bob's face burned with anger, but he stayed quiet. I said, "Get out." I roared. "Steve, it's my house too," Heather said, trying to hold her ground. "Not anymore," I snapped. "Get your things and leave." "I'll come back for my stuff later, when you've calmed down," Heather muttered, as Bob tried to pull her toward the door. "You'll be dead by then," I spat, my fists still shaking with rage. They left together, and as the door closed behind them, I lost it. I grabbed 2 beers and, in a blind rage, tore through the house, knocking over furniture, breaking anything I could get my hands on. I threw all of Heather's belongings onto the lawn and set the sprinklers on for 4 hours straight. Then I locked the doors and drank until I blacked out. The next morning, when I came to, I saw that Heather had come back in the night and taken her things. I was still angry. No, furious and utterly broken. I didn't call anyone to explain what happened, but I figured the neighbors already knew. Word travels fast. I called Heather's parents to talk to the kids, but her mom answered and stonewalled me. "Steve, Heather picked them up last night." "That's nonsense, Fran. She was picking up her clothes from the lawn. Let me talk to my kids." But she hung up on me. When I tried calling back, she didn't answer. Furious, I canceled all our joint credit cards and pulled all the cash I could from our bank account. I made myself some coffee, ate some toast, and started planning. First things first, I needed to change the garage code, get new locks, and move anything valuable to my brother's place. Just as I was about to leave, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw a man holding a large envelope. He waited a few minutes and then left it on the porch. I already knew what it was: divorce papers. I called my brother Gary and his wife, Andy, to explain the situation and ask them to keep it quiet. Then I headed to Home Depot to buy new locks. On the way back, I saw Bob's car in my driveway and Heather loading her stuff into it. I should have kept driving, but anger got the best of me. Instead, I floored it and swerved into the driveway, crashing into the back of Bob's car. Bob jumped inside his car just as mine made contact, pushing his car against the garage door. I reversed about 15 feet, floored it again, and rammed Bob's car straight through the garage door. Steam billowed from under my hood, and my engine made a horrible screeching sound, but I didn't care. I reversed again, backed up 10 feet, and floored it one more time. My car pushed Bob's only a few feet before stalling out. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I jumped out of my car, grabbed my son's aluminum baseball bat from the garage, and started smashing the windows of Bob's car. First, the driver's side window shattered, then the windshield. I was about to yank open Bob's door when I heard loud voices behind me. "Drop the bat and put your hands on your head," a police officer ordered. I froze, then slowly complied, dropping the bat and kneeling on the ground. They handcuffed me and shoved me into the back of a patrol car. Bob, looking shaken and terrified, climbed out of his wrecked car. I wanted to scream at him, threaten him, but the words wouldn't come. Heather stood off to the side, crying as she talked to the police. She glanced over at me, tears streaming down her face. I just smiled back, bitterly. At the station, they booked me and let me make one phone call. I called Gary. Since it was the weekend, I spent 2 nights in jail before seeing a judge on Monday. I pleaded not guilty, but the charges were serious. Gary bailed me out later that afternoon. "Steve, they're talking about attempted homicide or at least assault with a deadly weapon," he warned. "I know. First thing, let's go to the bank. Heather's probably drained the accounts, but I need to check." When I got there, it was no surprise. Every cent in cash was gone. The CDs and bonds were still untouched, but a court order prevented me from accessing them. Furious, I called Heather. "You could have left me $5 at least." "You really know how to clean someone out," I said, as soon as she answered. I needed the money for me and the kids. You can't blame me for that, she snapped back. And Bob? He's not making enough to cover things? I shot back, anger rising. I've got bills to pay, a mortgage to cover. Maybe I should just set a little fire in the living room. Warm the place up a bit. Steve, stop with the threats. You're not helping yourself. Her voice was cold. Why can't you just accept that it's over and move on? I'll move on when you send my kids back home where they belong, I growled. I can't, Steve. Not with the way you're acting. You need to calm down. I can't risk their safety. Maybe once things settle down, we'll work out visitation. But this is the last time we're talking. From now on, it's through my lawyer. You don't know how sorry you and Bob are going to be, I said before she hung up. When my court date arrived, my lawyer argued temporary insanity, saying my actions were a knee-jerk reaction to Heather's betrayal. Heather and Bob testified, claiming they were afraid for their lives and even requested a restraining order. The judge wasn't buying my side of the story. Mr. Moore, he said, looking sternly down at me, did you threaten Mr. Kelly's life, saying if he didn't leave, he'd be leaving in a body bag? I don't recall exactly, Your Honor. But if your best friend was sleeping with your wife, wouldn't you say something like that? The judge frowned. My lawyer leaned over and whispered sharply, Steve, keep your mouth shut. From now on, you don't remember anything. You were acting out of shock. Remember that. He was right. I needed to play this smarter. My boss, Chris, stood by me, testifying that I was a reliable, level-headed employee. After his statement, we wrapped up and waited for the verdict. Back at the office, Chris tried to lift my spirits with a crude offer. You know, he said with a smirk, I know some guys who could make Bob and Heather disappear. Wouldn't even cost that much. I shook my head. No, I'll handle this in my own way. Months later, though, it felt like everyone, Heather, Bob, and the legal system, was out to destroy me. The divorce went through, and Heather got half of everything. The house, the valuables. It was all to be sold off. She even accused me of stealing her jewelry, when in fact, mine was missing too. The whole thing was a mess. You've got to be kidding me. I yelled at my lawyer after the judge's final decision. I'm the one in jail, and they're taking everything from me? Steve, it could have been a lot worse. You could be facing a manslaughter charge if things had gone any further. With good behavior, you'll be out in under 8 months, and your record can be cleared in a few years. Just do the time, keep your head down, and get through it. That was easy for him to say. The idea of spending months locked up wasn't something I could stomach. I filed an appeal, but it got me nowhere. In less than a year, my life had gone from stable to completely broken, all because of Heather and Bob. Your job will still be here when you're out, Chris told me before I went in. Just don't do anything stupid inside. Watch your back. Before I reported for my sentence, I had one last visit with the kids. It broke my heart, but there wasn't much I could do. Gary, ever the dependable brother, was there for me. He made sure I had money in my inmate account, but the stuff you could buy in there was garbage. Without any electronics or a phone, I wrote everything down in letters and made collect calls to my family every couple of weeks. During one visit, Gary told me, I've got your car fixed up. Use the insurance payout to cover it. I'm keeping an eye on the lawn, and I changed all the locks. Heather took most of her and the kids' clothes, but the furniture's still there. Good, I said, relieved that at least some things were still under my control. Heather allowed my parents to see the kids, but she kept poisoning them with her words, calling me their jailbird father. I hated how she was turning them against me, but my parents put up with it to maintain some connection. After a week inside, I had visitation rights confirmed every other weekend, a full month in the summer, and holidays split between us. As the months dragged on, I focused on the little things to keep my mind occupied. I wrote letters, planned for when I got out, and kept in touch with Chris, letting him know I'd need some time to readjust once I was released. Finally, the day came when I could ditch the orange jumpsuit. When I stepped outside, Gary was waiting for me. Let's get a drink, he said with a grin. We headed straight for the nearest bar. To freedom, I said, clinking bottles with him and savoring the first of 3 beers. Andy's got dinner ready. Steak with all the fixings, Gary said as we left the bar. You can stay with us until you get settled back into the house. It's still on the market, but no offers yet. Heather wants to lower the price, but she needs your approval. I laughed bitterly. Figures. All the furniture's still there, but I trashed the master bedroom like you asked, Gary added. That night, the steak tasted like the best meal I'd ever had. I ate and drank more than I had in months, savoring the freedom to just sit back and enjoy myself. I vaguely remember 5 or 6 beers and at least 3 glasses of wine. The next morning, I woke up feeling rough but free. It was past 10 a.m. by the time I dragged myself out of bed. By 11 o'clock, I managed to get to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee and bacon greeted me, reminding me that maybe, just maybe, things would get better from here. I found a note on the counter. If you're reading this, you survived last night. There's coffee made and everything else is in the fridge. The spare bathroom has soap, a razor, shaving cream, a toothbrush, and toothpaste. If you need anything else, we'll get it tonight. The keys to your car and house are on the key rack by the back door. Don't do anything stupid. See you around 5:30. Gary knew me well. I poured myself 2 cups of coffee and grabbed an English muffin, but that was all I could manage. After a long, hot shower and a shave, I started feeling almost human again. Gary had laid out some fresh clothes, and within an hour, I headed back to my house. The outside looked the same as I'd left it, but sitting in my repaired car for 10 minutes, the memories came rushing back. Finally, I turned the new deadbolt and walked inside. The place was still a wreck. Clothes were scattered everywhere, old food rotted in the fridge, and dishes were piled high. Leaning against the sink, I saw the dent in the wall from where I'd punched through, hitting a stud. I rubbed my knuckles, remembering the anger of that night. Upstairs, the kids' closets were empty except for a few forgotten items. My bedroom, now nearly barren, had only my dresser and some leftover clothes. The dark patches on the carpet showed where our bed and her dresser used to be. The room felt cold and unfamiliar. Before I could sleep in here again, it needed a complete overhaul. The whole house did. At the bank, I confirmed what I already knew. Heather had emptied the lockbox. The bank provided video evidence, and my attorney filed a motion to force her to return what she took. She's offering her share of the house in exchange for your share of the CDs and bonds, my lawyer said. I didn't care. She needs to return everything like the court ordered, or face the consequences, I replied. My lawyer just nodded. His job was to protect my interests, and that's exactly what I was paying him for. Back at the house, I took stock of what was left. I called a local contractor to fix the holes in the walls and hired a cleaning service to take care of the kitchen, where I'd thrown the microwave and smashed the dishes. I needed a new bed too. There was no way I was sleeping on a mattress Heather had shared with someone else. I found a decent queen-size set for $900 and had it delivered the next day. Hank, the contractor, came by on Saturday to give me a quote. You've got some solid walls here. Must have hurt when you hit that stud, he said with a grin. Yeah, it wasn't my best moment. I just need the holes patched and a fresh coat of paint. Nothing fancy. He nodded. How about $200? That's a neighbor's discount. That's low, I replied, surprised. That's my price. Take it or leave it. After what you did to Bob's car, most of the guys around here think you did us all a favor. Even Randy told his wife he'd put her in the ground if she ever pulled something like Heather did to you. He chuckled. You're a neighborhood legend now. I thanked him and told him he could start any time. 6 weeks later, the house was cleaned and repaired, and the bonds and CDs were back in the bank. Life was finally starting to feel somewhat normal again. When the kids came to stay for their first weekend, things were awkward at first. I decided to break the ice. Kids, I know this is strange, but this is still your home. If there's anything you need to say, go ahead. My skin's pretty thick now. Not much can shock me anymore. John spoke up first. Dad, we love you, and we're sorry about what Mom did, he said quietly. Heather nodded in agreement. We didn't know about Bob until she told us we were moving in with him. We weren't happy about it, and we're still not. I sighed. It's okay. Even without Bob, your mom and I wouldn't have stayed together. What we had is over, but I'm still your dad, and I'll always love you. I'll always be here for you. We hugged, and by the end of the night, we were sitting together, eating pizza and watching a movie. I could have said a lot of things about their mom, but I held back. That first weekend was a success. We felt like a family again, even if it was different now. I got John a better haircut, and before long, life picked up a new rhythm. He started soccer, Heather was busy with dance, and they kept me occupied. Everyone, except my brother, kept telling me to move on. You're still young, they'd say. You can meet someone else, remarry, and start a new life. I'd always give the same response: forget it. I wasted 14 years on that woman. If I want to stay mad, that's my right. They hadn't lived through the betrayal and mess of the last 2 years. Sometimes, you need your pound of flesh to make the pain go away. One way or another, I was going to get mine. Heather kept pushing to lower the price on the house, but I wasn't budging. Steve, it won't sell at this price, she said, clearly frustrated. The market's terrible. We need to drop it by at least $220,000. If you want to give up that much of your share, fine. But I'm not budging, I told her. Eventually, we split the bonds and CDs. She blew hers on a new car and a vacation with Bob. I banked mine, starting a small nest egg for the future. 8.5 months after my release, something happened. Bob's house caught fire while they were at John's soccer game. Someone had soaked the electrical box and back of the house with gasoline. The fire destroyed the entire rear half, leaving them without power. The next day, 2 police officers knocked on my door. They brought me in for questioning, but I didn't give them anything. At the station, I just sat there, calm and silent, offering them nothing. They got nothing from me. I was at a neighborhood party with at least 10 witnesses, I said firmly as I stared down the 2 officers. Steve, you were only a block away, one officer replied, clearly not convinced. You could have done this. Prove it, I shot back. I'd had enough. Standing up, I said, charge me, release me, or I'm calling my lawyer. After a tense pause, the officer finally nodded. We're letting you go, but we'll be watching you. As they left, I mentally checked them off my list. 1 down, 2 more to go. With Bob's house still being repaired after the fire, the kids couldn't stay there, so I volunteered to take them. We ended up having an impromptu vacation together. It was good for all of us. Then, one night, as Heather came to pick them up, she looked me straight in the eye. Steve, I know you did it. I don't care what the police say. I smirked. I don't know what you're talking about. I was with our friends, remember? Too bad you and Bob aren't welcome there anymore. Maybe I could put in a good word for you. My sarcasm dripped heavily. Don't bother. We wouldn't go, even if they begged us, she said, sounding bitter. Well, at least you 2 have each other. That's what really matters for now, I added, letting the last words hang. Her eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Just that you and Bob are lucky to have each other, I said with a sly smile, this time letting the satisfaction show. The kids had been asking to spend more time with me, and that didn't sit well with Heather or Bob. I'd heard from a neighbor that they were having shouting matches with the kids telling Bob he wasn't their father. Heather had accused me of stirring things up. Heather, I said calmly when she confronted me, I don't badmouth you to the kids. I've told them they have to listen to you because you're their mother. What about Bob? She asked, eyes cold. He's a backstabbing moron who's lucky to still be breathing, I replied bluntly. But aside from that, sure, he's a decent enough guy. Her glare could have killed. He's good to your kids, Steve. Stop filling their heads with nonsense. I'm not going to badmouth him to them, I said, my voice lowering. But that doesn't mean I won't celebrate the day I get to piss on his grave. Her face went pale with fury. Steve, so help me. What are you going to do, Heather? Cheat on me again? Divorce me? Throw me in jail? Make my life hell? Oh wait, you've already done all those things. What else could you possibly do? Without another word, she turned and stormed off, and I couldn't help but shake my head. How had I ever loved her? Work, on the other hand, was going great. It didn't take me long to get back up to speed, and soon Chris was pushing me to handle more clients. With no one at home, I had the time, so I took on 4 additional accounts. Most were straightforward, but one, 2 Corp, was a different beast. They were undergoing a massive manufacturing shift and needed constant updates, which meant I was traveling to their facility every few weeks. Their lead engineer was brilliant but disorganized. and every call was a battle for the data I needed. Chris, I said after a particularly frustrating call, if I don't get what we need soon, their whole system is going to collapse. Eventually, Chris assigned an intermediary, Monica, to smooth things over. When I met her in person for the first time, she greeted me with a handshake. Steve, Monica Bradley, she introduced herself. She was efficient, organized, and had a degree in process engineering, having worked with the company for 5 years. 2 weeks before we wrapped up Phase 1, I decided to show my appreciation. Monica, I'd love to take you and your husband out to dinner as a thank you. There's a great restaurant at the Hilton where I'm staying. How about 6 o'clock? She smiled and agreed. But when she arrived, she was alone. Where's your husband? I asked. I'm not married, she replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. Oh, sorry. I assumed. I glanced at the rings on her finger. She laughed softly. I wear these to keep things professional. No one bothers a married woman, and it helps avoid awkward situations. Plus, people seem to think married employees are more stable. I nodded, surprised. That's a clever strategy. How do you handle company events? I just say my husband is out of town. People stopped asking after a while. Well, you fooled me. We had a nice dinner, and by the end of the night, I found myself telling her about the last 2 years of my life. That's awful, she said, genuinely shocked. I can't believe they did that to you. Yeah, well, it's all in the past now, I replied, though revenge was still fresh on my mind. You're still young, she said, giving me a warm smile. A lot of women would be lucky to have a guy like you. Maybe, I said, shrugging, but I haven't exactly been in the mindset to date. She tilted her head playfully. You asked me out, didn't you? I asked you and your husband, I reminded her with a grin. Well, if I hadn't been married, would you still have asked me out? She asked, smiling wider now. I paused. Probably. You're easy to talk to, and you're definitely not like my ex. She laughed, and dinner ended on a light note. I left the next day, and though I wouldn't be back for a month, we stayed in touch through calls and emails. After a couple of months, things progressed, and eventually, we started seeing each other more regularly when I was in town. Even with my trust issues, I found myself finally letting my guard down a bit. We'd go out most nights when I was in town, and it wasn't long before things got more physical. Slowly but surely, I was starting to feel like myself again. Like maybe I could rebuild my life after all. One evening, as we were making plans, Monica mentioned she had a conflict the next night. Steve, how about we plan for a whole evening on Thursday instead? She said with a smile, kissing me lightly. Thursday works. I'll remember to bring protection, I replied, grinning. I spent Wednesday browsing for a new restaurant on the city map. After 6 trips, I'd already tried most of the local spots. I found a promising Indian place about 25 minutes away and decided to give it a shot. I ordered a beer and the sampler platter, ready to unwind. But halfway through, I heard a familiar laugh. Glancing over, I was shocked to see Monica with another man. They weren't just friends. They were holding hands and laughing like a couple deep into their relationship. Suddenly, I wasn't hungry anymore. I finished my beer, paid the bill, and left. She didn't look conflicted in the slightest, which told me everything I needed to know. I avoided her the next day, opting for McDonald's at lunch instead of our usual spot. But by 3 o'clock, she was shadowing me, smiling and flirting like nothing had happened. You take care of that conflict last night? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Yep. And tonight, I'm all yours, she replied, leaning closer. I found a cozy, quiet Indian place with a great sampler platter, I said, looking her right in the eyes. Her face went pale. What kind of food? Indian. You know, the same place you were at last night with someone else? My stare never wavered. Her eyes widened in panic. Steve, I can explain. No need. I've already been through one lying witch. I don't need another. I stood up, walked away, and cut my trip short. I ignored the 4 emails she sent after that, and eventually, she stopped trying. Trust was hard to come by, and Monica had just worsened it. Thankfully, I was reassigned to a new client, this time, a guy. 3 months later, I got an unexpected early Christmas present. Bob was hit by a car while crossing the street. Witnesses said it was a black sedan with tinted windows, just like my BMW. The police came to my house that Saturday night, and my neighbor Tom watched as they approached. "Mr. Moore, we'd like to have a word," the shorter officer said. "No problem, Tom. I'll catch up with you later." I called to my neighbor, then turned to the officers. "What's this about?" "Mr. Moore, do you own a black BMW 320i?" the other officer asked. "Yes, I do." "Why?" I joked. "This about a parking ticket?" They didn't laugh. "Is the car here?" they asked. "Yeah, it's in the garage." "Seriously, what's this about?" I replied, growing uneasy. "Sir, we'd like to see the car," the officer said. I led them to the garage, where one of them started taking photos of the front right side of the car. "Can you explain these scratches on the bumper?" he asked. "Not really," I replied. "It's an 8-year-old car. Scratches are normal wear and tear. Why this sudden interest?" "There was a hit and run yesterday," the officer explained. "Witnesses saw a black sedan with tinted windows, just like your car. And just like a million other cars in this town," I said, getting annoyed. "Did my license plate match? Did anyone ID me as the driver?" "No, the witnesses only saw the car." "Well, as you can see, there's no significant damage to my car," I replied, gesturing to the bumper. "And I can account for my whereabouts yesterday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Why target me?" "Your history with the victim and past threats made you a person of interest." "Who was hit?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Mr. Robert Kelly," one of them said. I smiled. "Is he dead?" "No, but he's in critical condition," the officer replied as they left. I closed the door, opened a bottle of wine, and ordered a pizza. I ate most of the pizza and downed the entire bottle, celebrating. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and everyone had something to say about Bob's latest misfortune. Some said the guy just couldn't catch a break, while others whispered that he got exactly what he deserved. Either way, I was on cloud 9. 2 days later, Bob's condition took a turn for the worse, and he died. For his funeral, I wore a new suit, got a fresh haircut, and even had my car washed and waxed. The funeral home wasn't packed, but there were plenty of people milling around outside when I arrived. As I walked in, conversations came to an abrupt halt. I didn't bother signing the guest book. I simply walked down the aisle toward the casket. Heather saw me and her face turned pale, but the kids smiled when they noticed me. Heather tried to intercept me before I reached the casket, but I pushed past her. I'd been preparing for this moment from the second I stepped inside. Standing in front of Bob's peaceful body, I spit right in his face. It dribbled down onto his shirt. Heather screamed, hurling every insult she could muster. This time, I didn't hide my smirk. "2 down, 1 to go," I whispered to her as I walked out of the now silent room. Her tears turned to fear, and she froze, watching me leave. Over the next month, the police questioned me twice more at Heather's insistence. She tried to claim that just because it wasn't my car didn't mean I wasn't involved. But they had nothing on me. The investigation dragged on for a few months, and eventually, it faded from everyone's minds. Then, one day, I saw the patrol car pulling up to my driveway. I had been expecting them. I locked up the house as my neighbors watched me being escorted back to the station. "Mr. Moore, do you know a man named David Kent?" one of the detectives asked, showing me a picture. "Sure do," I replied. "Why? How do you know Mr. Kent?" "I hired him to keep an eye on my ex-wife," I said casually, pushing the photo back toward them. "He's been on and off for about a month now." "Why did you hire him?" the detective asked, sounding irritated. "Ever since she hooked up with her now-late husband, she's had a streak of bad luck," I said, smirking slightly. "My kids live with her, so I hired David to make sure they were safe, especially at night." "Well, your ex-wife reported that she was being followed. She saw Mr. Kent several times and called us. When we picked him up, he told us you hired him," the detective said dryly. "This borders on harassment, Mr. Moore. You could face charges if it continues." "I'm just looking out for my kids. I don't care what happens to Heather, but my kids are different. If this is a problem, maybe your department should be doing a better job ensuring their safety," I said with a shrug. "But if it's that big a deal, I'll back off." The detective raised an eyebrow. "It's not illegal, but you're pushing the limits." Why don't you try talking to your ex instead of hiring people to follow her? Last time I tried that, I ended up in jail, I said, leaning back in the chair. They let me go with a warning, but I knew they'd keep an eye on me. I didn't mind. I hadn't paid David to be subtle. I wanted Heather to notice. And the next guy I hired? He was even more obvious, the type you'd expect to see in a Hell's Angels movie. He cost $30 an hour and worked 3 hours every fourth night, but the results were exactly what I wanted. My goal was to push Heather over the edge, hoping that if she had a breakdown, I'd get full custody of the kids. I wanted my family back, my kids at least. Steve, what the hell do you want from me? Heather screamed into the phone, her voice frantic. I want you to choke on your spit and die, Heather, I said coldly. She hung up immediately. That seemed to shock her. I was waiting on my porch when the police arrived. You're late, I told the officers with a smile. Heather had reported me, claiming I'd threatened her life. But I had already contacted my lawyer, who was waiting at the station. My client expressed a wish, not a threat, my lawyer explained calmly. Heather took it as a threat because she's being followed by people your client hired, one officer said. It's not illegal to hire someone to keep watch, my lawyer shot back. Unless you have a recording of Mr. Moore making an actual threat, you have no case. Mr. Moore, why don't you just move on? The officer said, his patience wearing thin. She left you. It happens. If she snaps and something happens, we'll come for you, the other officer warned. Is there any way to end this? I asked my lawyer. My client wants his children back, he answered smoothly. If Mrs. Kelly relinquishes custody, he'll back off. That's for the court to decide, the officer said before they walked away. My lawyer and I left the station shortly after. The following Sunday morning, while I was having breakfast and reading the newspaper on my porch, the doorbell rang. Heather's parents stood on the doorstep, dressed for church. Steve, do you have a minute to talk? Her father asked. Sure, come on in, I said, stepping aside. Can I get you some coffee? No, thank you, Heather's mother replied politely. There was an awkward pause before her father spoke. Steve, we know our daughter hasn't made the best choices, he said slowly, and sending you to jail wasn't right, but we're worried about her. She's our only child. I'm not trying to hurt her, I replied, my tone firm, but she's made her bed. All I want is my children back. They're better off with me, especially with all the bad luck she's been having. I'd hate for something to happen to them because of her. They exchanged uncomfortable glances. We'll talk to her, but you know how she is, her mother said, trying to smooth things over. That's where you're wrong, I said, my voice colder now. The woman I married would never have cheated, never thrown me under the bus. I don't recognize her anymore, except as the mother of my kids. I hope she suffers a slow, miserable end. They didn't linger long after that. I think I made my point. That Thursday evening, the visitor I'd been expecting finally showed up. It was just after 7 o'clock, and the sun had set, casting the porch in shadows. She must have walked because I hadn't heard a car pull up. When I looked through the peephole, there she was, Heather, looking angrier than I'd ever seen her. I opened the door. Come in, Heather. Want a drink? Maybe some hemlock on the rocks? I said, smirking. Very funny. You're a real jerk. You know that, she snapped. I reopened the door. I think we're done here. Thanks for stopping by. Have a short, miserable life. I'm not leaving until we talk, she said, marching past me and settling in the living room. Suit yourself, I muttered, heading to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine. What brings you to my humble abode? I asked as I returned, glass in hand. I still own half of this house, she reminded me. Less what I've paid since the divorce, I corrected her, sipping my wine. I want this place sold. What's it going to take for you to drop the price? She demanded. An act of God, I said dryly. Or you can cover the loss with interest. I just want you out of this neighborhood and away from me, she shot back, her voice rising. That's never going to happen, I replied coolly. You still hate me that much? She asked, her voice softening just a little. More than you could imagine, I said, the bitterness slipping through. She sighed, sounding almost regretful. It was terrible how everything went down, but I never meant to get involved with Bob. It just happened. I laughed darkly. Nothing just happens, Heather. Unless he had a gun to your head, you did it willingly. Was he really that much better in bed that you destroyed our marriage and our family? It wasn't about that, she protested, her voice defensive. Bob needed me. He had no one else. We fell in love because we needed each other. Charity work. Huh? That's what you call it. I said, my anger rising. Well, I needed you too. Our kids needed you. But you chose him. Now he's dead and a lot less needy, I added, relishing the memory. Her face paled. I wish I'd been the one driving that car, she confessed quietly. You've become so hateful, Steve. Taking pleasure in someone's suffering. It's not right, she said, shaking her head. I didn't get here on my own, I snapped. You and Bob played a big part. And don't give me that everyone makes mistakes nonsense. I don't care about other people's marriages. How long was I the fool? She looked down. Does it matter now? She asked softly. It does to me, she said, sounding tired. 2 months? 3? 5? About 5 months, I said, my voice flat. You almost told me, didn't you? She nodded. I was devastated, Steve. I almost came clean that first time. But you didn't. You kept doing it. How many times did you sleep with him in our bed? I demanded, my voice tight with fury. Never. I would never do that to you, she said, her voice rising with anger. Right. Just everywhere else, I replied bitterly. Our friends knew, and not one of them told me. You've proven you can't be trusted. So where do we go from here? I retorted, my voice cold. This house is the only connection we still have, Heather said, trying to keep her voice steady. What about the kids? I shot back. I'm not giving them up. Nothing you say is going to change that. She shook her head. Steve, I know I won custody because of what you did, losing it on Bob and his car. Maybe if that hadn't happened, you'd still have a chance. But now, Bob's gone, and it's just you and me. Her eyes widened as she added, Steve, are you threatening me? I smirked. Me? Deprive my kids of their mother? Never. But, if something were to happen, like a heart attack or a freak accident, I'd make sure the kids always remembered you fondly. Got any last requests? You might want to write them down soon, just in case. I borrowed that line from a movie, a hitman telling his target to get his affairs in order. I couldn't resist using it. I'm out of here, Heather said, standing abruptly. We had 12 good years, and despite everything, I'm sorry it ended this way. She leaned in, trying to kiss my cheek, but I stepped back, pushing her away with enough force to nearly knock her over. Don't ever touch me again, I warned, my eyes burning with anger. You're nothing but a 304. She looked stunned, her face paling. I'm sorry. I just thought. You thought what? I interrupted, my voice low and seething. That we're okay now? You make my skin crawl. She stammered, sorry, looking both horrified and flustered. Don't be, because I'm not, I snapped. She quickly turned and walked to the door, heading down the driveway. I couldn't resist one last jab. By the way, you know that look you just gave me? Bob had the same look, right before the car ran him over. Too bad I didn't have a camera to capture it. I watched her run the rest of the way to her house, slamming the door behind her. The truth? I wasn't the one who ran Bob down. That was just dumb luck, him being in the wrong place at the right time. But I'll admit, I was the one who set Bob's house on fire. 2 Gatorade bottles of gasoline and a lit cigarette were all it took. I made sure the house was empty first. I'd hoped it wouldn't be reported to the fire department until it was fully engulfed, but that didn't go as planned. Still, it only took me 5 minutes from start to finish, including tossing the plastic bottles into a neighbor's recycling bin. I'd excused myself to use the bathroom during a party, slipped out the side door, and made my way through the backyards to Bob's house. No one even missed me. I would have loved to take credit for Bob's death, but that wasn't my doing. If the idiot had just looked both ways before crossing the street, he'd still be alive. But Heather? She and her family still think I was involved. In a way, it's almost disappointing that I wasn't. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm not going after Heather. Not physically. I'd already been to jail once, and I have no desire to go back, especially not to the penitentiary up north. No, I'll just drop hints and innuendos until she drives herself insane. Maybe then, the court will hand the kids over to me. And if anyone asks about buying the house, I'll be sure to mention the arsonist in the neighborhood, who still hasn't been caught. You see, I like where I live. And I like the fact that my kids are just a few blocks away. Who knows? Maybe when they hit their teenage years, they'll want to live with their old man. I can hope. But there's been one good thing to come out of all of this. I met someone. Her name's Ellen. She works for the State Department of Corrections. We met when I had to check in with her for that first year after I was released. You know, to make sure I was adjusting, rehabilitated, and staying on the straight and narrow. Ellen doesn't take crap from anyone. She's tough, no nonsense, and after a while, we started talking beyond the formalities. Ethically, she couldn't date me while I was on probation, but once that year was up, we went on our first real date. I told her up front that I had serious trust issues. She laughed and said, "Most convicts lie to me in one way or another, so you're not alone." That kind of honesty was refreshing. Now, we're figuring things out together, dealing with our issues as we get to know each other better. Ellen made me reflect on what I've been doing since Heather walked out. She pointed out that my actions, my obsession with revenge, were keeping me from having any kind of real life. She told me I needed to move on. And you know what? She was right. She convinced me when she said, "If you screw up and land yourself back in jail, your ass is mine." And darling, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. She said it with a smile that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up, and I believed her. I still do. Ellen keeps things interesting, but more than that, she's someone I know I can trust. She's the kind of person who wouldn't cross me, and I'd never dream of crossing her. For the first time in a long while, I think I'm finally ready to move on with my life. Maybe even open myself up to love again.